I'm Claire Frew from Homeless Network Scotland, and I'm going to use this short video to tell you a bit about homelessness across the country, the impact of the coronavirus pandemic, and a bit about what comes next. Now, you'll understand that we don't have a huge amount of time, so I will not be able to cover absolutely everything, but hopefully I will be sharing with you some of our main experiences and our priorities for the future. But let me begin by looking back just a little bit to the statutory homelessness data published by the Scottish Government for 2019-20, taking us up to the end of March this year. Now, this obviously coincides slightly with the beginning of lockdown, but by and large, we're talking about the period running up to the pandemic. Now, what we know through the statutory data is that 31,333 households were assessed as homeless in Scotland, and that was 4% more than in 2018-19. And at the 31st of March 2020, we had 11,665 households in temporary accommodation across the country, and that was 6% more than the previous year. Households spent an average of 184 days, or 6 months, in temporary accommodation, and the data also says that this on average was longer if the household contained children. So hopefully that gives you just a little bit of a sense of where we were against our major statutory indicators of homelessness and how well we are doing. And then we faced the challenge of lockdown. So on the 23rd of March 2020, the First Minister told us all to stay at home. And she told us to keep a 2-metre distance between ourselves and anyone else who was not a part of our household, and also told us to self-isolate if we had any symptoms of the virus. Now, I'm sure you can imagine, for the homelessness sector, this posed a number of obvious questions and challenges, starting with the main one of how do you stay at home if you don't have one? Or what if your home isn't safe? And how do you maintain social distancing or self-isolate if the accommodation you do have is congregate and shared with many others, or at least the cooking area and eating area and communal areas are shared with lots of other people? And I include in this night shelter accommodation, where tends to be, it would be in the 2 biggest cities of Glasgow and Edinburgh, where people would largely have a mattress on the floor in a large room shared with potentially 30 or more other people. So how should the homelessness sector respond to all of this? Respond to the demand for services, keep working with the people who were already in temporary accommodation before the pandemic started, and make sure that everything we were doing was safe and secure in terms of the medical advice round about the virus. So we start by treating homelessness as a public health emergency. And I'm sure that some of you hearing this will be thinking, isn't homelessness always a public health emergency? And shouldn't it always be a public health emergency? Now, this is a conversation that I would love to have with you all at another date. But what I will just say for now is, because the country was in a recognised crisis, a recognised health crisis, that opened up doors that were just hadn't been available before. So our immediate starting point was rough sleeping. Now, those who are familiar with the homelessness sector and people's experiences of homelessness will know that actually the vast majority of people who experience homelessness don't sleep rough. But there's a very particular bit about, say, people who have no accommodation at all, or at risk of having no accommodation at all. So to limit the spread of the virus, the night shelters for rough sleepers in Glasgow and Edinburgh were closed. And the Scottish Government made money available to purchase hotel rooms, which were empty as a result of the lockdown, for people sleeping rough in Glasgow and Edinburgh. Really important to note that this emergency response did include people with no recourse to public funds who would otherwise be sleeping rough, and that this would not normally have been the case. And in the absence of a public health emergency, our responses would not normally be extended to people who are assessed as having no recourse to public funds. And these strong partnerships, additional funding, and swift action, swift and urgent action, saw rough sleeping numbers across the country reduce to almost zero. And it really was a significant achievement for everyone involved, and something that everybody has been really proud of achieving. But what about temporary accommodation more broadly, I say for people who were already there and new people coming into the system? So in addition to the emergency hotel rooms purchased through Scottish Government funding, local authorities and partners mobilised to make use of empty council and housing association homes as self-contained temporary accommodation or short-term lets. And this included councils reallocating empty stock that they had as temporary accommodation, and housing associations offering any empty properties they had. And we say that these were there for temporary accommodation or short-term lets because, again, the reason they were empty was that the restrictions of lockdown meant that a lot of the allocations and lettings process had, if not stopped entirely, was down to such minimal levels. So people who had planned to move over the spring or early summer into their new council or housing association home had not been able to do so. So rather than them sitting empty, they were made available to local authorities as self-contained, safe, temporary accommodation or short-term lets. And local authorities also increased the use of local hotel and bed and breakfast accommodation to reduce capacity in hostels and other types of congregate accommodation. While night shelters closed, other hostels and other types of accommodation didn't, but they were not able to run at what their capacity had been. Because those numbers would have been too high to be COVID safe, so had to find people alternative accommodation. And a number of local authorities also made use of empty student housing as temporary accommodation, forming partnerships with local colleges and universities, because again, when people were not staying there because universities and colleges were closed, that was just another opportunity to provide temporary accommodation for people when these buildings would otherwise have been empty or minimally used. And in terms of preventing homelessness, this is another really important point that we had to think about during the pandemic. We know that the greatest homelessness risk comes from poverty, and we know that the lockdown placed greater pressures on many household incomes. So to do something about this, this required government action beyond some of the operational things that were put in place previously to respond to rough sleeping. This included some legislative changes. So what we did see in Scotland was the emergency coronavirus legislation included an extension to the notice period for evictions from both the social and private rented sectors, largely intended that if people found themselves in financial difficulties because of the pandemic, had they lost their job or were in reduced hours, or any of the things we know were happening for people, that they were not at risk during this lockdown or during the pandemic of losing their home. And that was legislated for through the Scottish Parliament. The UK Home Office also paused evictions from asylum accommodation, initially for a 3-month period at the beginning of lockdown. And this was particularly important in Glasgow because Glasgow is a dispersal city as part of the asylum system. So if somebody was going to be evicted from their Home Office accommodation, it was more likely to have been there. So just another thing to try and prevent that from happening as well. And a couple of other points where the UK Treasury increased the local housing allowance rate to cover at least 30% of market rents in an area, taking some financial pressures off of private renters, and also increased universal credit payments by approximately £20 per week, initially for a 12-month period. So a range of things that were beyond the operation of homelessness services, but things that were going to contribute hopefully to reducing the numbers of people who were going to find themselves in the crisis of homelessness during the lockdown and the extended pandemic. And where did that leave us? I mentioned before that we had seen rough sleeping reduced to almost zero, which had been fantastic. And latest data for the end of October 2020, we were able to see that local authorities did continue to receive homelessness applications throughout the whole period, and they were only able to respond either online or over the phone. Some local authorities did say that their numbers were lower than they would usually expect compared to previous years, and others said that there was absolutely no difference at all. So as well as trying to manage the current crisis, they were also having to manage people coming through their door just as often as they always were, and this ranged across the country. And in terms of temporary accommodation, as I said, we outlined a lot of the additional temporary accommodation that was made available for people and the partnerships put in place to deliver that. And at the end of October, the number of households in temporary accommodation was 14,229. And if you remember, at the end of March, that was round about 11,500, just over 11,500. So even in that period, that is a 22% increase, and that is on top of what had been a 6% increase in the previous year. So we are seeing significantly more households in temporary accommodation. And while permanent lets to homeless households have started to increase again recently, there are still restrictions depending on what tier you're in, what COVID tier you're in across the country. But that's meant a backlog. So people have moved into temporary accommodation, and we have not been able to move as many as normal out into their own permanent lets. So we do find ourselves with a backlog of more people than we're used to in temporary accommodation, and that they will be spending longer in that temporary accommodation until the number of lets get back to normal, and we're just not quite sure when that is going to be. So what comes next? Before the pandemic, the cornerstone of Scotland's homelessness policy was rapid rehousing and housing first, prioritising settled mainstream housing outcomes and reducing time spent in and minimising moves between temporary accommodation. So from what I've said, you can see that we have a bit of a challenge in front of us. But what the experience of the pandemic has shown us is that this is a direction of travel is absolutely the right one. The Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Action Group was reconvened during the pandemic to make some more recommendations to the Scottish Government to make sure we come out of the pandemic stronger than we were when we went in. And the Everyone Home Collective also formed during the pandemic. So this was two expert groups who have come together to think about the impact of the lockdown and what it means for our responses going forward. And I will summarise them very briefly. Again, does not cover everything, but just gives you a sense of what's going to be important as part of our recovery. Both groups, Everyone Home and the Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Action Group, really focused on prioritising prevention. We need to do more to make sure that people do not become homeless in the first place. And going forward, this includes the development of new legal duties to prevent homelessness in Scotland. This is something that England and Wales, other parts of the UK, have developed, and Scotland hasn't to the same extent. So we're looking at new legislation. The development of new pathways and protocols when people are leaving institutions such as prison. Really focusing on early intervention and new early warning systems, so we know as quickly as possible when somebody is at risk of losing their home, and also looking at a commitment of no evictions into homelessness. As we said, we're still in a place where there's a pause on evictions, but that will not last forever. But to really refocus after that, to say there will be times where eviction is necessary, but we cannot be evicting households into homelessness. Settled housing options, and this is the bit where we were mentioning about this was already our direction of travel, really having a homelessness system that very, very quickly moves people into their own settled, secure housing in local communities across the country, and not seeing large numbers of people in the homelessness system for a long time, for spending long periods of time in often unsuitable temporary accommodation. That system doesn't work and it doesn't deliver outcomes for people. So to achieve this in the long term, what we're asking for is a commitment by the Scottish Government elected in the election next year to commit to building 53,000 affordable homes over the life of the next Parliament, with 37,100 of those for social rent. And the evidence tells us that this will help to prevent homelessness, but also to move people out of homelessness. But in the short term, recommendation from the Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Action Group that to deal with the backlog that I was describing, we're going to need an increase in social lets to homeless households to 80 to 90% of all lets. Now, we understand that is a lot, but when you see the numbers we are talking about, with almost 15,000 households in temporary accommodation, that we're going to need the vast majority of social lets to go to homeless households to deal with that backlog and not leave people trapped, many of whom are households with children, in temporary accommodation even longer than they currently are. A lot of recommendations about bringing empty homes back into use, delivering housing first in every local authority area, and also through the Everyone Home Collective, talked about how the night shelter accommodation was closed during the pandemic, but actually we already knew that it was at best a sticking plaster response, and it is no way a long-term solution. So we want to take this time to actually design out the use of night shelter accommodation in the long term, and that from this winter is already starting to happen in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And going forward, we also need a greater equalities competence. We need to ensure our homelessness systems are gender sensitive, respond to the particular needs of young people, and as we mentioned before, continue to accommodate people with no recourse to public funds. We've made great strides in rough sleeping, and we cannot return. We cannot return to what went before, and we need our settled housing options for everyone to help make sure we don't take a step backwards, but also for people with no recourse to public funds. They have been accommodated during this crisis period, and we cannot return to not offering people who need emergency accommodation the very basic of accommodation. It's just not something that the sector wants to see happen, and we want to see an improved equalities competence going forward. So an awful lot for us to do, a lot of challenges in front of us, but with some of the successes achieved during the pandemic, we go into it with a bit of hope and optimism as well. If you're interested in finding out more about the Everyone Home Collective that I mentioned briefly, you can find out about their membership and the route maps they are publishing at www.everyonehome.scot. If you're interested in the Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Action Group and their 104 recommendations to the Scottish Government and the new action plan developed by the Scottish Government, you can go to www.gov.scot, or there's a summary of the HARSAG recommendations published by Homeless Network Scotland on our website at homelessnetwork.scot. If you want to stay up to date with the latest statistics, you will find the monthly dashboards published by the Scottish Housing Regulator at www.housingregulator.gov.scot, and please follow Homeless Network Scotland on Twitter at HomelessNetScot and Housing First Scotland at HF Scotland. And it's just there to just say, please keep in touch. We're happy to share with you how things are going, where things are going well, what challenges we continue to face, and what progress we are making. I say we have a big few years in front of us, but we remain committed to ending people's experience of homelessness in Scotland. And the only thing that will ever end people's experience of homelessness is safe, secure housing. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening, and I really do hope that you enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you.